Birds and Bees Don't Fuck is produced by Champagne Womb LLC for your entertainment and education. It contains material that may not be suitable for those under the age of 18. Audience discretion is advised. The opinions, thoughts, and ideas expressed by guests on the show are solely their own. Now, without further ado, please enjoy the show. I hate to be the one to break it to you, but sex education of the past failed us. Because birds and bees, they don't fuck. Welcome to Birds and Bees Don't Fuck, a podcast where we learn exactly how bad our formative sex education, or lack thereof, really was. I'm your host, Ariel Zadok. I'm a producer, intimacy coordinator, and sexologist. My guest today is a sex educator, fed up feminist, queer mom, and co-host of the Fuck Yeah podcast. Welcome to the show, Sarah Tomchesin! Yay!
Thank you so much for having me. I think I'm going to have to steal that intro as how I introduce myself from here on out.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm happy to be your cheerleader in the corner being like, yeah!
I'll take it.
The first thing I thought of just now was, you're my sister in fucks. Which is a very funny thing to say, but between our two podcasts and both having fucks in there and, you know, all the different things we do, the fuck yeah and birds and bees don't fuck just made me think that. So welcome to my brain.
Yeah, 100%. It's so funny how we know people from the internet, which is how I know you. And yet we've got so much like, how have we not interacted directly before now?
I know. It's so funny because I always say, as a sexologist and an intimacy coordinator with like 20 years of production experience before any sexuality stuff, really, I'm like, if there was a Venn diagram between sex and production, it's just a circle. I'm just a circle. And then I look at you and your experience and I'm like, she's just a circle too.
Totally.
So yeah, tell me about your there's so much that you do in sex education right now, and you actually are on the board of an organization that I love and that I support. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, SECUS is the board that I'm on, Sex Ed for Social Change. And the organization's turning 60 this year, actually,
60.
which is pretty amazing. So when you think back to that time and the sexual, like, it was really the early stages of the sexual revolution. So SECUS has changed a lot over the years. They started out as an advocacy organization, but also more focused on sex education curriculum and actually developing curriculum. And in that 60-year time span, there's been so many new organizations that have formed. If you're here in Los Angeles, you know that the Planned Parenthood sex ed curriculum is really fantastic. It's a peer education model that works really well. So in the last 5 to 10 years, SECUS has really taken on more of a policy, advocacy, and support role with giving support to state initiatives. So helping to develop policy around sex education for the whole lifespan at the K through 12 level, and going in and helping communities learn how to organize and advocate for sex ed policies. And SECUS is unique in that we look at things as sex education affects us at so many different intersections of our lives. And it goes way beyond teen pregnancy prevention. So they've been a big part of that movement of like, no, sex education is not about teen pregnancy or STI prevention. It's actually about understanding your whole self, being able to engage in healthy relationships, understanding consent, boundaries, communication. So it's like, when you've got politicians out there really sort of bastardizing the conversation around sex ed, like sex ed in schools in particular is so rarely even really about sex. We're actually really talking about just how to understand ourselves, how to communicate and be a respectful citizen with other people, how to understand bodily autonomy. So this is kind of the world that that SIECUS lives in, and also just recognizing that the health outcomes, what it means to assert bodily autonomy is really different based on your identity, your race, your sexuality, all of those kinds of things. So, yeah, SIECUS is an amazing organization.
Yeah, it really is. And the thing that really got me when I discovered it was the policy side of things, because we can be out here talking and educating and sharing information and trying individually to get into schools and work with school boards and principals and PTAs and everything. We can be doing all of that work. But unless the policy is changing, nothing is going to change. So it's so
Yeah.
important. Like right now, if you are not registered to vote, there will be a registration in the show notes. So make sure that you're registered to vote, because these things really do matter. It is the policy that drives so much of this stuff. We can scream from the rooftops, but if we don't have legislature supporting that,
Yeah.
we're just kind of screaming into the ether half of the time.
Yeah, and you've got, folks on school boards in local politics who just really are not the experts as far as sex education and sex ed curriculum goes, and they're the ones making the decisions. So getting educated, there's a new initiative that SIECUS started this year called the Sex Ed Futurist campaign. And you can get on their email list, and they will send you updates about policies that are relevant for your area, elections that are happening, those sorts of things, so that you can know how to get involved on your local, state, and even federal level. And they are starting to do some education and online events for adults as well, which is really
Yay!
cool because, we know that there's just such a huge gap, and most of us are entering adulthood really without the skills or the knowledge that we're advocating for in terms of where we want the curriculum to be today.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when we're thinking about the people who are making up the rules for all of this stuff, because there's two sides of that. First of all, they're not experts in the field. They don't necessarily have the tools and resources to know what an age appropriate, accurate sex education program could look like, because that's not their field. It's not their specialty. It's like if they're trying to teach brain surgery, well, they can't, because that's not their specialty. They don't know enough about it. They know it exists. They have brains that they use, but it doesn't mean that they're qualified to teach anything about brain surgery. And then the other side of that is that, the whole point of this podcast is that all of us were failed in terms of learning sex education and learning about our bodies and learning about autonomy and consent and communication and all of these things. Well, we were all failed. And that includes those folks that are making up the rules, that oftentimes they're struggling with their own sex and their own bodies and their own communication and their own boundaries. And so now you have folks who, even the well-meaning ones, but you have a group of people who don't necessarily have the professional experience to speak on it. And also, just like every single one of us struggles with it in their personal life as well. So it's a really interesting thing when we kind of break down, like, oh, yeah, you should have experts in there. We do need people who know what they're talking about, having the leadership position in these conversations.
And it's interesting because you would think that this is a contentious issue based on how particularly the right and in political circles you hear sex ed talked about. But actually, when you look at polls, most people are in support of sex ed. What starts breaking down for parents is, because we didn't receive the education, there is a fear that kids are going to come home and talk about things that are beyond our level of understanding, and that we're not going to know how to answer questions. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't give our kids access to that information and that we shouldn't be open to having these conversations at home, because even if you don't have the answer, you can help find the answer for your kid. You can research it together. You can learn together. And that process is just as helpful for, like, you don't have to have the answers all the time, right?
Yeah.
But parents really overwhelmingly want experts teaching their kids
Yeah.
about sex, relationships, communication, consent, all of these things. Like, there's actually not an issue around, as a country, we want that for our kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Because again, like I work with adults. So it's like these adults have kids too. And they have to now, as adults, go out and seek the information because it's just not anything that was ever normalized. So it can be a scary thing. You can compare it to, oh gosh, Common Core math, I think it's what it's called.
Oh, yeah.
I don't have kids, so thankfully, I have not had to do this, but they shifted the math curriculum and the way that we literally solve problems. They changed the whole thing. All math equations are now different because now they're teaching Common Core. And so this was a thing that was very frustrating because I do have a lot of friends who are parents that had to like figure this out with their kids, and their kids would come home with questions and they're like, I don't know how to do this. We got to figure this out together. But that's a bonding experience. And that also teaches your kids that there's a way that when you don't know the answer to something, that you can use critical thinking, you can look up resources, you can ask for help, you can get to all of these other ways to get the information that you got to get to in the end. So it's like, I get that it's scary, especially because, again, people find it so difficult to talk about sex in the first place, let alone with their children. So there's a lot of barriers there. But at the end of the day, like, there's no losing in this situation. There's just none.
Yeah, the math example is sort of perfect because we're dealing with this in my house for sure, where math just looks so different. And I was actually really a math nerd in school and I love math. And so I get excited about it because I'm like, oh, I can see how you're developing such a strong foundation of like an understanding of numbers through this methodology. But it does take a lot of kind of rewiring your brain to figure out how to do it. My co-parent is like totally afraid of math, so it creates a lot of stress for her. But the thing that's interesting is it's like when a kid comes home with a math problem, chances are that you are not going to have years of baggage of stigma, shame, and those sorts of things associated with the math question that they have. It's easy to say, like, I don't understand this at all, right? But somehow when it comes to sexuality, we both expect ourselves to just have all of the answers from day one. We don't think of it as being a learned skill, when in fact, sex is absolutely a learned skill, just like everything else. And we also have all of these misconceptions about it because we've been fed all of this really conflicting messaging about sex and sexuality, and particularly, depending on your identity, that baggage can be even greater. So it's like, yeah, we have a real uphill battle as adults trying to just like navigate the world of sex ourselves. But then when you bring kids into the mix, suddenly there's just a lot of baggage that has gotten passed down that suddenly you're like, ooh, wow, okay. There's some stuff to unpack here.
Yeah. And, the unfortunate truth is that a lot of people don't want to unpack it because that's very uncomfortable. And again, like, it's shame and it's ego too, because everyone wants to think that they know everything. And, it's such a loaded conversation. However, the more we can normalize the conversations and the experiences of shame, of ego, of like, all the discomfort, the more we can normalize that and be like, yeah, of course you feel that way. Because we didn't have to do this. No one gave this to us. No one showed us how to do this. And we're all just here trying to undo it. Let's unravel this little sweater here and we can do it together. But, I get that it is challenging.
Yeah.
For sure. So where did you grow up?
You know, it's funny. I grew up all over, and it definitely impacted my learning as a kid because I changed schools every year until high school.
Oh, wow.
But I did go to high school. I started in the LA schools in 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
So I do not remember having any sex education until 8th grade.
Oh, wow. Okay. And eighth
Yeah.
grade were what, like 14, I think?
Yeah, I think
15?
I was
Oh, no, eighth
13
grade. Yeah, that's younger
when
because
we
ninth grade.
moved to Los
Yeah.
Angeles.
Yeah. Which
Yeah.
is pretty late when you really think about what's going on in our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's always hard for me to identify because, for instance, like I did pre-algebra 3 years in a row because it just happened that the curriculum at the schools from moving schools was different everywhere. I didn't get any basic grammar. So it's entirely possible that the school districts I was in like had sex ed, but I just happened to miss it each year.
Mm-hmm.
And so by 8th grade, I had science class. And I remember my science teacher, I mean, probably in the gamut of teachers that I've had, like the most desexualized person I can think of as like presenting this curriculum. And I, we had an earthquake in the middle of our sex ed lesson. This was my first earthquake I had ever experienced. I got my science teacher, who is just absolutely like the last person on earth that you want to be teaching you about, human anatomy.
Oh my
And then
gosh.
we got interrupted with an earthquake. So you can imagine that I did not take very much away from those lessons.
I mean, I do like that you were in an earthquake with a science teacher. I feel like that part kind of checks out a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my God. That's like, some that teacher was probably like, oh, thank God.
Yes.
I don't have to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I might have been in that same boat because, I mean, it's just like at that age, too. I mean, you really have to be starting the conversations earlier than that because by the time kids are 13, I mean, you just are up against so much social baggage, having to sit in a room and hearing about periods and pregnancy and vulvas. And I'm pretty sure the word was vagina. It was
Yeah.
not vulva that was
Yeah.
used, but like learning about genitals, and it's just so uncomfortable.
Absolutely. All while you're in the midst of puberty and all
Yes.
sorts of things are happening to your body and all sorts of attractions are coming up. And, it is to start the conversation so late in a human's life when they have been living with these body parts for 13 years and those body parts have already, for the most part in many of their bodies, gone through those changes. Many of them at age 13 have already had their first wet dreams without a clue of what that might be. Many of them have already ejaculated from actually masturbating, and not knowing that was like, I've spoken to men before that they would play with themselves all the time. And then all of a sudden one day this stuff came out and they were like, what just happened to me?
Right.
I mean, that's terrifying for a kid. And because there's so much shame and parents aren't talking about it either, generally speaking, then you're just like, what?
Yeah.
That's scary.
Yeah.
It's
I
really
mean,
scary.
my kid is 8, and the pediatrician at our last appointment gave us a pamphlet on puberty. And I really appreciated that the doctor initiated the conversation and just started kind of presenting in age appropriate ways. Like, these are some of the early stages. I was a little shocked because, my kid is 8. I was like, wait, already we're getting this information. But, what the pediatrician said is that kids are starting to go through puberty a lot younger.
Mm-hmm.
And so started introducing some of the stages of puberty to my daughter. And I really, really appreciated it because we then also had a tool that we were able to take home and talk about the information that was in the pamphlet. My kid had some questions. Like, it was a really positive experience. And I was like, yeah, we should be having these conversations at this age.
Yeah. And it's really that we need to be supporting parents with all of those tools and resources. And here's how you can initiate that conversation. And here's stuff that you can talk about at this age. And let's talk through what's coming up for you. Like, where are you feeling the stickiest in this? And really just give that care to the parents because, again, they weren't taught. They weren't taught how to
Yeah.
have the conversations. In so many cases, their parents never had a conversation with them. I mean, I don't think my parents ever talked to me about sex for anything. Like, there was no, sex for the first time conversation. There was definitely no masturbation conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, my parents to this day are still so incredibly uncomfortable that I work in sexuality. And my mom, I'm really proud of my mom. Over like the last 5 years, she's gotten a lot better. She can like sit through a conversation. I was telling her about an expo that I went to. I went to a Vibe Expo and X3 and XBiz and all of that. So I
Uh-huh.
was sensitive with the conversation. I wasn't necessarily telling her that it was like a big sex toy conversation and a performer expo or whatever. But she did quite well. But, that's what so many parents themselves are dealing with is that generational gap between their parents never talked to them, but now they want to have the conversation with their kids, but they're so uncomfortable and they don't know how, and it wasn't done with them. Or if it was like, I've had so many stories of like books shoved under door frames and like never to be spoken about
Mhm.
again. Or, we're all flopping around here like fish out of water.
Yeah, it is the blind leading the blind for sure. And I mean, it carries over into adulthood too. Like, I had experiences being pregnant, and now I'm going through perimenopause and realizing, like, oh, we just did not have these conversations in our family about, because you can learn a lot about what your process is going to be like as you go through the changes of life by knowing how, I mean, in my case, like, the women in my family navigated those changes, what sort of things came up. And at each stage, I realized, like, oh, I have a ton of questions in terms
Mm-hmm.
of what to expect, and really like no really solid information to pull from.
Because it was all hidden, especially when it comes to people who have uteruses
Yeah.
and identify as women and go through all those changes. I mean, think about how much we've shamed and shadowed miscarriages that we don't. I mean, even when
Yes.
you look at sex education resources for the most part, and like people who have done research and are out in the world with menopause and perimenopause, there's just so little out there. We're starting to see that now. Definitely, there are definitely people that are like, wait a minute, we need more, or I'm going through this, I need more, I'm going to build more. We're definitely seeing that more, but that is absolutely an area of education and research that's just been missing because for so long our society just wrote off women once they were no longer baby making machines.
100%. Yeah, there's such a lack of medical research. I mean, with female test subjects to begin with.
Yeah.
But when you get past reproductive age, there's just this huge drop off in terms of actually looking at the health conditions that come up for women. So, for instance, I'm 41, and earlier this year, I developed frozen shoulder. And, was going to all of these experts in like PT and orthopedic specialists and yada, 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 all men.
Mm.
And no one mentioned to me that this is a very common symptom when your hormones start fluctuating in perimenopause. Women in their early 40s are actually the most prone to frozen shoulder. But I was being treated as if I had an acute injury. And it took me months through my own research to realize, like, there's a hormonal imbalance that's happening here. And it's only when I've been able to address some of the hormone stuff going on in my body that I've actually been able to make any progress with things like physical therapy. So even medical professionals are
Yeah.
ill-informed about women's health issues.
Well, I think it's worth noting that unless a doctor has gone out and sought out sex education specifically, unless they have taken a specific program around sexuality, they are not trained in sexuality. That
Yeah.
is not a part of the standard medical curriculum. It's not a standard part of any curriculum. I think that's starting to change in some programs now, but generally speaking, when you go to a doctor, they don't have training in sexuality. They just don't.
Yep.
It's just not something that they do. They also don't have training in nutrition. Those are two areas that are so important to our overall health and our body's functionality, and the people that we're putting full control of our bodies into the hands of these folks are so unfortunately not getting that education and training. They're trained in different ways and they know so much about so many other things, but this is such an integral part of our health and well-being and just overall systems that it blows my mind every time it comes back to that, because it's true. And I had something similar, different but similar. I was like, quote unquote, allergic to alcohol for years, from like 18 to 25. And I went to gastroenterologists. I had cameras in my stomach. I was doing tests. I was trying to figure this out. Like once I hit 22, because I was like, this is weird. Like when I was, not that I should have been drinking before I was 18, but I was like, it was fine. And then all of a sudden, I don't know what changed, but now like my jaw will lock up if I have a sip of alcohol. Like there is a problem. This is weird. Why can't we figure this out? Eventually, just in my path, I got myself off of birth control because I just didn't want the hormones and everything like that. And I was learning about how bad it can be for some bodies, for a lot of bodies. But so I got myself off of birth control, and then all of a sudden I could drink again. Didn't think about it. Like a year or so later, I went to a walk-in clinic because I had a cold, and the doctor was asking me if I had any allergies. And I was like, well, I did. And it was a woman. And I was like, I did have this weird thing with alcohol for a while. And she asked if I was on birth control. And I was like, yeah, I was until this time. And she's like, well, that's what was happening. They're both processed through your liver, and your liver just can't handle both of those things. So it was rejecting the alcohol. And the more you gave it, the more your body was learning to reject it. And I was like, what? How did this one person in a completely unrelated appointment just solve that problem that multiple doctors couldn't figure out? All men.
Yep.
No one even asked if I was on birth control.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are we doing here?
I know. I mean, that's such a great example of how, what you're describing as far as the gaps in education. And, the same, if there are any listeners who are going through perimenopause or menopause, the same is true for menopause, that there's basically a luncheon's worth of training on, post-birthing age women's health. So if you're like struggling with stuff where your body is just starting to feel sort of out of your control, which was, I turned 41 and all of a sudden shit just got wacky for me.
Oh my God.
You have to go see an actual menopause specialist, because they're the only ones who have gone through any additional training to actually be informed on those hormonal changes.
Yeah. And thankfully the research now is starting to ramp up a little bit, because there are a lot of people who are going through that, and they're like, they are professionals in our field, and they're just pissed that like this stuff doesn't exist. So they're starting to focus, and I'm seeing that more and more, which is really great. But yeah, I mean, it's all the stuff that we just need to be talking about more and normalizing the conversation. I mean, all of it comes back to normalizing these conversations and trying to get as informed as we can and share that information.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think, on a lighter note, like things are really headed in the right direction. I agree with you on that.
Yeah. What a great time to be alive. So how great, and also real not so great sometimes. So how did you find your way into sex education from that, from the earthquake to making moves? Yeah. I don't know.
I joke that my friend dragged me in. I was doing some organizing. So there's an event in Los Angeles called Dyke Day LA.
Oh, yeah.
And I was part of the founding group of that free, family-friendly, all-ages Pride event. And so I was doing some organizing with a friend, and she was like, you would be really excellent at sex ed. You should really consider coming over to Babeland and joining me and working at the store. And I was like, that's interesting. We were in a queer femme performance group together. People would label us as burlesque, but I think we had a whole lot more social commentary than that title necessarily gives credit for. But yes, we did take our clothes off. And I was applying to grad school, and I was like, well, this actually sounds like a lot of fun. And this might be a nice kind of holdover job to have as I figure out, what I'm going to do on my social work path and stuff. So I started working at Babeland, and which is a feminist sex toy store, and they have a peer education model, which is derived from the old Good Vibrations model when Good Vibrations was still a collective. And, this is just really passed down through that kind of second wave feminist history of a real lack of education. And so peer to peer training and teaching. And I, as a performer at the time, it just sort of brought together so many things I was really passionate about. I knew that I would do some sort of helping profession. I also loved any opportunity to be in front of people and speak. And, I started finding kind of some like edutainment style classes that I could teach that really brought together the performative elements and the sex ed. And so for many years, I did a lot of skill-based sex education for adults. Pleasure-based sex ed is what we call it. And just loved it. I mean, the lack of education that is out there means that when you give people positive information about their bodies that make them feel empowered, it is such an incredible connection that you make with people in just helping to normalize these really, kind of simple skills that we need in order to feel confident having sex, giving pleasure to our partners, understanding our own bodies. And, since I would say that my education has moved a little bit away from kind of the skills-based teaching, and I do a lot more somatic work now and grounding and just pleasure rather than necessarily orgasms or sex. But that's how I got my start.
I love it. I love that you just like stumbled into it.
Yeah.
You stumbled into bed with sex education.
Yeah. Yes. Much to my parents' chagrin as well.
Oh, yeah.
You were saying earlier, but yeah, my mom has also come around. She's come to some of my classes. She's a big supporter now, but it was a struggle in those early years. I think it really challenged what they saw as a legitimate and meaningful profession. And yeah, I had to break out of a lot of those ideas of like what it means to be quote unquote successful or, I don't know, I guess just legitimate in the eyes of the world. I had a lot of baggage to work through in those early years. And maybe I think in some ways I still do. I don't know if you have this experience where sometimes when like a random person, like my new physical therapist, when she asks me what I do, I'm like, I always kind of do that dance of like, okay, do I focus more on sort of like the marketing consulting work that I do, or do I actually come out and say, oh, I'm a sex educator? Because, the reactions you get really run the gamut.
Yeah, and I love how you use the language coming out as, because I think that's
Mm,
really valid because I have a friend who is she's a great BDSM coach. She teaches classes every single Saturday, but she's not at a point. I had her on the podcast and she's not
mhm.
at a point where she is out as a
Mm,
BDSM coach and as an educator, even though she's been doing this
yeah.
for years and is like really well ingrained in the community. She's brilliant. She's wonderful. I censored her on the podcast. So I gave her like a little blurb over the video
Wow,
because she's
amazing.
just not at that point. She's getting
Yeah.
there and she's like, I think I am there. If you buy her classes, she's there. I mean, and obviously also if you hire her as a Dom or a coach or anything like that, like you obviously get all of her. But in terms of the public eye, she's not out yet. And I think that's an experience that a lot of sex educators can relate to, or just people who work in sexuality at all, even if it's burlesque or the performance arts, like a sensual performance art.
Mhm.
There is a coming out that's involved because of the reactions that you get from family, because of the ramifications that you might experience from your day job. There are definitely things that happen or can happen when you choose this path. And so it's not always the easiest path. And that's not even talking about the challenges around censorship online and how to get classes out there and how to get your message out there and, shadow banning and blah, 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 blah. But I love that you used, you know, coming out as a sex educator because that's such a valid thing, and also the multi hyphenate because I'm the same way.
Yeah, it's like, even though it's other people's shame, stigma, and lack of understanding, it can get
Mm.
exhausting to be constantly kind of in the public eye around um, being sex positive, not having shame around it, and making it your life's work. It's
Mhm.
just not valued by our culture, really. And and then there's so much tension there, right? Because you're talking about censorship and the ways in which you can use sex to sell products. But if you're trying to bring any attention to something that is a service or a product that is going to improve people's sex, there is just so many challenges with marketing it and so much censorship, lack of credit card processing
Mhm.
and banking and all of these things. And this is not even like scratching the surface when we're talking about like sex work, right?
Oh
And like
yeah.
all of the helping fields that are sex work adjacent and the
Mhm.
struggles that you come up against in terms of trying to help people specifically around their sexuality or helping to meet people's sexual desires. So it's like it's pervasive in the culture, and yet the
Mm.
second that you're actively supporting people's sex and sexuality, like, oh no, 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 that's not acceptable.
Oh yeah,
It's
you
such
can
a double
use
standard.
absolutely. You can use sex to sell, but you can't sell anything sex related. And definitely you can't use sex to sell that. Like you can't use a hot chick to sell like a vibrator or something like that,
Yeah.
like you can't have like the whatever burger joint that is that has like the Paris Hilton ad of her like getting down on a burger in like a super
Mm-hmm,
super
mm-hmm.
sexual way, like
Yep.
that's cool, but we can't be like here is this grinder that if you can't access this part then it can, like you can use it on this part of your body and it's accessible, whatever. Like we can't just be giving information. So
Yep.
it's a really
Yep.
difficult double standard. And we also have to figure out how can we get the information out there in a way that it's actually going to be seen. So it's, that's also why I love edutainment so much because it's like, what's the sneaky way to get it in?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, and I'm gonna have to bring up the sexism of it all as
Mm,
well,
mhm.
because I think it was Unbound who did a test case. And I love these companies
Yes.
like Unbound and
Mhm.
Dame who are really challenging these community standards through, really putting their money where their mouth is. So they developed a social media ad campaign for a fake male sexual enhancement product. All of the imagery is like heavy lifting, weightlifting, and like hyper masculinity. And it was very apparent that the product was a masturbation sex toy.
Mm-hmm.
All of their ads went through and were approved. But their ads centering female pleasure in a much more subtle way with, like floral imagery and like light colors and being like, not as overt about the sexual benefits of the product. Absolutely, you cannot get an ad approved that is going to enhance female pleasure in any sort of way.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, yeah, it's we've got a real issue in our culture around sex, particularly if we're talking about women having any sort of autonomy over their bodies or, God forbid, experiencing orgasm.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Pleasure for someone with a vulva? Are you out of your mind?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have such a long way to go. And again, a big part of that is dismantling the shame that's surrounded by sex and normalizing the conversation so that we can center on pleasure and we can call out the disparity and people can advocate for that. So, I mean, we have such a long way to go. But we're getting there, I guess.
Yeah. Little by little.
Little by little, just like chipping away, chipping away. And speaking about pleasure, you and Anne have a program that's coming up soon too.
Yes. Anne Hodder Ship, who I think you had on the podcast recently.
Yeah.
We've been teaching together. I guess it's really been for the last 4 years when we all sort of started making this shift into the digital space. So we've taught a number of workshops and facilitated groups together. And this series is really a culmination of those classes that we've been doing over the last 4 years. It's called Pleasure Attitude Reassessment, and it is a 4-week course. And the focus is on self-care, really, and sourcing your pleasure, understanding your relationship to pleasure, unpacking all of the roadblocks, dismantling the work that your pleasure role models have done for you. Because for most of us, the relationship to pleasure that we have seen in our family systems, in the world, is like, these are not the folks who are qualified to teach us how to nurture and care for ourselves. So really, like, the first couple weeks is about really understanding your relationship to pleasure. And then we start layering in some tools that are individualized for folks to be able to feel like they can have a positive, sustainable relationship with pleasure, sexual and non-sexual, and actually understand the tools that they need to bring into their life and the things that they need to let go in order to be able to really have access to pleasure, joy, groundedness, these kinds of things in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, it's really hard to experience pleasure in this one area of your life if you're not used to experiencing it in all of the other areas that exist as well, because pleasure is not specific to sexual experiences. Pleasure is all around us, but it is a muscle because we're just not taught to prioritize that in any way. We're not taught to slow things down and embrace things and, again, navigate what does and doesn't work for you and walk away from that. And I love your focus on self-care there, because we have gotten to this place, especially over the last 10 years, where we're talking like so much about self-care this and self-care that, but it's commercial self-care, and it's bullshit. And
Yeah.
it's like, buy this mask and, you know, get this robe or whatever. But like, what does that really mean? Are you just spending your money because an Instagram ad that they didn't ban is telling you to buy this
Yeah.
and put it in your self-care ritual? Like, are you just doing it
Yeah.
because you have to check off a box? Like, what does self-care actually mean? And what does that look like for each individual? So I love the focus on self-care and self-pleasure in all of the different ways, because that does, like, how can we possibly expect ourselves to experience pleasure with other people if we're not able to do it in our day-to-day and with ourselves?
Yeah, I think when you ask most people, like, what does self-care mean? Or how do you practice self-care? Like, you get kind of a blank stare, because I think it's become a popular term, but I think that you're correct that it is very commercial. It's a way of selling things like, add this to your life and you're going to feel better. But actually, a lot of that stuff is a Band-Aid. I mean, I love bubble baths, right? Like, they're amazing. But if I'm once every month taking a bubble bath and I'm not actually addressing all of the like pleasure de-accelerators, my breaks that I have in my life, like I have a total lack of time. Um, I have no even idea of what it looks like to be with myself, or what care and nurture works for me. Because for some people it's going to be like, if you give me 20 minutes to sit and read a book, like that is what I need to fill my cup. And I think that I believe really firmly in the power of sexual healing. But the fact is that we all have so much going on in our lives that our relationship with our sexuality is gonna ebb and flow.
Yeah.
Our sexual relationships are going to evolve and change depending on what's happening in our lives. So if sex is your only source of joy, you're going to come up short sometimes, right? And so it's like, to really develop a holistic relationship with pleasure, I love this analogy of it's a muscle. Like, you have to understand how to work this muscle, and you've got to have a few different ways that you work this muscle so that it stays, use it or lose it, right? Like, we've got to have a nice toolbox that we can pull from to feel empowered, grounded, excited about life, and like we are in a balanced relationship with our reward pathway, right? Like, if you are living an incredibly stressful life and once a week you fuck really hard, like, great, I'm so happy for you. Like, that's a great place to start. But there's like a way to have pleasure as part of your daily life as well.
Yeah. And if we want to even take that further, the amount of people who are having not so great sex, and if that's where you're trying to derive your one place of pleasure and it's happening once a week, maybe once a week, and it's not even great when you get there, then like we're not reinforcing anything. Then it's like, okay, well, let's work on it elsewhere, because we know the amount of people who are having not great sex, and that's a whole other issue to address. But part of having great sex is that pleasure practice outside of the bedroom, that pleasure practice outside of that one container, because that's just, like you said, one specific way to experience pleasure and to indulge and to slow down. But so often we're so crowded with all that other stuff that even when we do get to that point, maybe the skill set isn't there, maybe we're tired, maybe we think, like, there's so much else going on that if that's like your one opportunity to experience pleasure and then it didn't happen, then that rolls everything back even further outside of that situation too.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think a lot of people are dissatisfied with the ways that sex is integrated into their lives. And I don't think that the answer is necessarily, I mean, for some people, this might be the case, but I don't think the answer is necessarily, oh, just have more sex. That's going to make you feel better, right? It's like you've got to diversify your relationship and your understanding of pleasure and prioritize it in your life. And so, yeah, I'm really excited. I always get a lot out of teaching, and this course in particular, we only offer it once a year, and it's always just really fantastic. And we evolve it each time. And so I'm excited to see what comes out of this group. We start on March 14th, and it is 4 Thursdays in a row, and it's online. And you can sign up at sexplus.com. We'll put it, the sex has a 3 instead of an E.
Yes, because again, censorship. That's, I use FCK instead of fuck just so I can exist everywhere. And it's not going to be
exactly
blocked in email boxes and all that stuff. So we have to be so sneaky all the time.
I know. We have so for the Fuck Yeah Pod, we have a Gmail account, but you cannot have the word fuck in your Gmail account. So it's fyeahpod@gmail.com. And it's just like I had a period of time like when TikTok was really getting going where I was really mad about people spelling sex either SEGGS or SECKS. Like I was like, this is ridiculous. We're adults. And now I'm in a place of like, no, you know what? If the online programs need us to code switch, like I will do all of the code switching you need me to do so that we can just get the information out there.
I had the same exact experience. It was infuriating. And I'm like, I refuse. And then I'm like, oh, I have to. But you know what? It's the same thing as, I've been a woman in production for my entire career. I've been the only woman in the room outside of maybe costumes or wardrobe or actors because I came up as an assistant director and doing producing and stuff like that. And so like oftentimes I'm the only other woman in a room and the only woman in a more traditionally male position because they always used to be. And so it's like, you have to play the game to win the game. So it's like, okay, if you want to hire me or whatever, just because you think I'm hot or whatever, fine, fuck you. Do whatever you got to do because I'm going to actually excel over you anyway. So like whatever it is, that's cool. Like let's play the game because you're living in that world. I'm living in this world. I know how to play in your world. You don't know how to play in my world, but I know how to play in yours and I will play the game well. So it's like, it's like, great. Okay. We'll do whatever we got to do because the message will be there or the work that I want to do is going to happen. Or, it's frustrating to have to do those things. Yeah. And at the same time, once we can be like, all right, you know what? We got to play the game if we want to win the game. It's the same thing with legislation and all of that stuff. It's like I hear a lot of people that over different things that are like, I'm going to do it a different way and I'm not wanting to. And it's like, cool. But if you want to change this system, you have to be in the system to change the system. So it's a shitty reality that like we have to play within these things that they're censoring us. But it's like, but we're still going to do it. You're not going to stop us from doing it. We're just going to figure out how to do it here. And through figuring it out how to do it here, we will then change what that looks like. Because I do think that over time, that is going to change and we will be able to say sex and penis and dildo and all those things without censoring ourselves. But we have to be in the system to change the system, which again is why CCAS is so important.
Yeah.
Circling it back to that one. Yeah. Well, it is also that time that I'm going to ask you. For the comedians, they get a pop quiz, but you don't get a pop quiz. You just get to share what you want people to know or maybe a little sexy tidbit that you want to leave people with, just a little something that would be like your version of a pop quiz, but we're just giving the answer away.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think, gosh, it might not be that sexy, although on the other side of it, I think you feel a little sexier. I mean, I think a lot of folks, socialized female, can relate to being people pleasers. So as a people pleaser, I wish I had known that really knowing myself trusting myself and coming from that place of nurturing myself was going to be kind of the most important work that I do in my life. So I think if you are, my little piece of advice is start doing something every day that builds your trust in yourself. I'm not saying you have to totally ditch the people pleaser. Like, I'm a way better caretaker, parent, partner, all of those things when I'm coming from a grounded place of like feeling like my needs are cared for. It is not petty. It is not frivolous to take really good care of yourself and to just really trust your instincts. I think that the benefits are, span your whole life. So that's my little tidbit of information. Know yourself, trust yourself.
I love that. I've coached a lot of moms, and the amount of excuses they will give me for not going to that yoga class or, taking an afternoon to themselves and everything. And it's a lot of work to rewire that system to help people understand you are going to be a better mom when you allow yourself to do those things. So I love that you brought that up, especially from the parenting perspective, because you are a better parent, you are a better partner, you are a better human when your basic needs are being met and when you are giving yourself permission. So to everyone listening, we are giving you permission to take care of yourself.
Yes, I love that.
Yes. So where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find our course if you're going to be on social. We are at Pleasure Guides. That's Anne and I. When we teach together, we use the handle Pleasure Guides. We are on sexplus.com. And if you want to check out my podcast, it is the Fuck Yeah Podcast at Fuck Yeah Pod on Instagram and TikTok.
Yay. And you just came back, you just passed the year mark, didn't you? Something like that.
Yeah,
I think you did you had the 50 episodes. So, and it's like pretty much weekly. So I'm doing math here.
We launched our first episode in September of 2022.
Wow. Congratulations.
So we're officially a year old.
So fun. That's so fun. Congratulations. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If you like this podcast, then tell your friends, like it, subscribe, give us a 5-star review. It's a little baby podcast, so I will take any and all the help you can give us. We also have merch now. I made merch, so I'll put that. Yeah. I have to get one that's the other side. So when I have people here in person, we each have one that faces the audience. But anyway, we've got stuff like that. I've got classes. I've got a yes, no, maybe list that you can download for free that helps with sex and communication with a little class to go with that. So just go to birdsandbeesdon'tfuck.com with or without the U, because I did buy both of them. But again, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is so much fun. And that's it. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.